In the autumn of 1879, a series of unsettling events began to unfold in the quiet, historic town of Salem, Massachusetts, a place already steeped in tales of unexplained phenomena and dark histories. Over the course of 3 months, 5 families, comprising 22 individuals, vanished without a trace. Not kidnapped, not murdered, they simply abandoned their homes, their livelihoods, and their very identities, walking into the whispering woods as if compelled by an unseen force. The local constabulary found no signs of violence, no evidence of coercion. Yet, entire bloodlines disappeared overnight, leaving behind only their possessions, and a single, chilling name whispered by terrified neighbors, Nathaniel Hawthorne. What the authorities discovered in his private study would challenge everything they understood about the human mind, and what they chose to bury would haunt Massachusetts for generations. The science of 1879 had no name for what Hawthorne had become, no explanation for his methods, and no way to comprehend the systematic destruction of human will he had perfected. Before we continue with the story of Nathaniel Hawthorne and the families who walked willingly into oblivion, make sure to subscribe to never miss stories like this. And let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our audience across America. The truth of what happened in Salem that autumn would remain buried in official records for decades, dismissed as mass hysteria by a science too primitive to understand the darkest capabilities of human manipulation. Salem, Massachusetts, in 1879, was a community of around 25,000 souls, a bustling port town still holding on to its colonial charm and puritanical roots. Its narrow, winding streets, many still cobbled, were lined with grand Federalist-style houses and the occasional gambrel-roofed colonial, their weathered clapboard siding and intricate doorways reflecting centuries of history. The town was a hub of maritime trade and burgeoning industry, with ships constantly arriving at its wharves and new factories rising alongside historic landmarks. The town boasted numerous churches, from the venerable First Church of Salem, a Congregationalist stronghold, to newer Baptist, Methodist, and Catholic parishes serving its diverse population. Reverend Elijah Sterling, a descendant of one of Salem's founding families, presided over the first church with sermons that often reflected on the town's historical anxieties, particularly the infamous witch trials. His counterpart, Father Michael O'Malley, ministered to the growing Irish Catholic community, offering solace and a sense of belonging in a sometimes unwelcoming Protestant landscape. The heart of the community's intellectual life was the Salem Athenaeum, a prestigious library and cultural institution housed in an imposing brick building on Essex Street. Founded in 1810, the Athenaeum drew scholars, writers, and curious minds from across New England, offering access to an extensive collection of books, scientific instruments, and historical documents. Its reputation for intellectual discourse made it a source of tremendous pride for the community, and memberships were coveted. Nathaniel Hawthorne had arrived in Salem during the spring of 1877, carrying with him a leather-bound satchel filled with letters of introduction that spoke of his extraordinary insights into human psychology and his revolutionary approaches to understanding the darker facets of the human soul. His credentials were impeccable: a graduate of Bowdoin College, known for his keen observations of human nature, and a distant relation to the famed author, a lineage that lent him an aura of inherited intellectual gravitas. At 45 years old when he first arrived, Hawthorne cut an imposing figure that commanded immediate attention. Standing just under 6 feet tall, he possessed the slender build of a man consumed by thought, yet moved with a quiet intensity that hinted at hidden depths. His most striking feature was his eyes, a deep, penetrating blue that seemed to absorb every detail, making conversation partners feel as though he could peer directly into their innermost thoughts. His dark hair, though showing streaks of gray at the temples, framed a face marked by an almost perpetual expression of contemplative seriousness. Hawthorne's voice was perhaps his most remarkable asset. He never raised it above a measured, almost melodious tone, yet somehow commanded absolute attention whenever he spoke. Audiences at his occasional lectures described it as mesmerizing. Fellow scholars found it compelling, and even Salem's most cynical citizens found themselves drawn into extended conversations with the new resident. There was a deliberate cadence to his speech, a careful modulation of tone and rhythm that made even the most mundane observations sound profound, as if each word carried a hidden, significant meaning. Hawthorne's academic pursuits were unlike anything the Athenaeum had previously sponsored. Rather than the traditional historical or scientific lectures, Hawthorne encouraged what he called introspective ethnography. He assigned his occasional research assistants and informal students to keep detailed journals documenting not just historical facts, but their emotional responses to human behavior, their observations of societal norms, and their private thoughts about the moral dilemmas presented by the human condition. These journals became the foundation of Hawthorne's research. He would spend hours reading each entry, making careful notes in the margins, and then conducting private conferences where he discussed not just academic matters, but the deeply personal insights the individuals had shared in their writing. His collaborators found these conversations both thrilling and unsettling. Thrilling because Hawthorne treated their thoughts with a seriousness no one else had ever shown them. Unsettling because he seemed to understand their inner lives better than they understood themselves. The Athenaeum's public lectures saw a surge in attendance under Hawthorne's informal guidance, growing from a modest audience to standing room-only crowds by the autumn of 1879. Intellectuals from as far away as Boston and New York began traveling to Salem to hear the man, who was gaining a reputation as one of New England's most innovative thinkers on human nature. The waiting list for his private study sessions grew so long that some offered substantial donations to the Athenaeum in hopes of securing a place. Hawthorne lived alone in a grand, 3-story colonial house on Chestnut Street, a structure with 15 rooms that had been built in 1790 by a wealthy merchant family. The house, with its stately façade and manicured gardens, came to represent his quiet but prominent presence in Salem. Hawthorne had furnished it with an eclectic collection of antique books, psychological treatises, and strange artifacts from his travels, including a collection of antique masks from various cultures. Neighbors noted that he employed only a single, elderly housekeeper, preferring to maintain the large house himself, and that he entertained no casual visitors, living in a scholarly solitude that some found admirable and others thought peculiar. His daily routine was as precise as clockwork. He rose each morning at 4 a.m., spending 2 hours in his private study, reviewing the journals his research assistants had submitted. The previous day, at 6 a.m., he would take a solitary breakfast in his dining room while reading correspondence that arrived regularly from colleagues at various universities and intellectual societies across the globe. He would then spend his mornings at the Athenaeum, deeply immersed in historical texts or engaging in quiet, intense conversations with visiting scholars. But it was his evening routine that had begun to attract notice throughout the community. Each night at precisely 7 p.m., regardless of weather, Hawthorne would emerge from his house wearing a long, dark overcoat and carrying a leather-bound notebook. He would walk the streets of Salem for exactly 3 hours, following a route that took him past the homes of the town's most prominent and established families. He walked slowly, deliberately, pausing frequently to observe houses with the intensity of an architect studying blueprints. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, whose house sat at the corner of Chestnut and Federal Streets, had the best view of Hawthorne's evening perambulations. She later described his behavior to Constable John O'Connell. He would stop at each garden gate, sometimes for 15 or 20 minutes at a time, studying the houses as if he were memorizing every detail, Mrs. Vance recounted, a shiver running through her. He carried that journal everywhere, and I often saw him making notes while he watched. When I asked him once what he was writing, he just smiled in that peculiar way of his, and said he was conducting phenomenological observations, studying how people existed in their natural domestic environments. Other neighbors confirmed similar observations. Hawthorne would position himself where he could observe families through their windows during the evening hours when curtains hadn't yet been drawn. He seemed particularly interested in moments of family interaction, parents disciplining children, husbands and wives in quiet conversation, siblings at play. His attention was so focused and sustained that several residents had begun closing their curtains earlier in the evening, feeling uncomfortable under his scrutiny. When questioned about these observations by concerned parents, Hawthorne would deflect with scholarly explanations about his interest in domestic psychology and the social dynamics of established communities. He spoke of writing a treatise on American family life that would contribute to the emerging field of social philosophy. His explanations were always plausible, delivered with such intellectual authority that questioners felt foolish for having raised concerns about what was obviously legitimate academic research. The autumn of 1879 had arrived early and with unusual intensity. A persistent, bone-chilling mist rolled in from the harbor, cloaking Salem in a perpetual dampness that seemed to seep into the very foundations of the old houses. By October, the days were noticeably shorter, and a sense of pervasive gloom settled over the town. The unusual weather forced families to rely heavily on indoor activities and close-knit gatherings, creating a sense of isolation and vulnerability that would prove crucial to the events that followed. It was during this period of enforced intimacy and dependence that Nathaniel Hawthorne began implementing the methods he had been developing since his arrival in Salem. The long, misty nights, the closed windows, the intimate family gatherings around hearths, all provided perfect conditions for the systematic observation and psychological mapping that would become the foundation of his most sinister work. The first family to disappear was the Fairchilds. Arthur, a prosperous shipping magnate whose vessels brought goods from across the globe to Salem's bustling port, his wife Eleanor, and their 4 children, Clara, aged 15, Thomas, 12, twins Emily and Elizabeth, both 8 years old. The Fairchilds were among Salem's most respected families, known for their generous contributions to the local hospital and their unfailing philanthropy to the town's less fortunate. Arthur Fairchild had built his prosperity through shrewd business dealings and an almost supernatural ability to predict market trends in the volatile global economy of the 1870s. His shipping office on Derby Street was always filled with the scent of spices and foreign woods, a testament to his far-reaching ventures. His reputation for integrity had made him wealthy, and his wealth had made him influential in town affairs. Eleanor Fairchild was equally respected, known throughout the community for her leadership in the Ladies' Benevolent Society and her tireless efforts in organizing relief for families struck by illness or misfortune. She was a poised, elegant woman with a gentle demeanor and intelligent eyes that missed nothing in her careful observations of community life. The Fairchild house on Washington Square was frequently filled with visitors seeking her counsel on matters ranging from social etiquette to charitable endeavors. Their children were the pride of the family. Clara, the eldest, was a talented artist whose watercolor landscapes were admired even by critics from Boston. Thomas showed promise as a budding naturalist, spending hours collecting specimens along the rocky coast. The twins, Emily and Elizabeth, were known for their identical appearances and their synchronized movements, often seeming to anticipate each other's thoughts. On the evening of October 2nd, 1879, the Fairchild family had appeared entirely normal to their neighbors. Arthur had spent the day at his office, overseeing the unloading of a new shipment of tea from China. Eleanor had attended the weekly meeting of the Ladies' Benevolent Society, where she had volunteered to organize a Thanksgiving feast for the local orphanage. The children had attended their regular lessons, Clara at the Salem Female Academy, Thomas at the local grammar school, and the twins with their governess, Miss Alcott, who taught them languages and music. The family had taken their evening meal together as usual, sharing conversation about the day's events and making plans for the coming weeks. Arthur had mentioned his intention to expand his shipping routes to South America. Eleanor had spoken of her desire to host a winter charity ball to raise funds for the poor. The children had been excited about the prospect of a family trip to Boston during the Christmas holidays. Nothing in their behavior suggested any distress, any conflict, or any intention to abandon their comfortable life. Yet, when Mrs. Eleanor Vance arose at dawn on October 3rd to prepare her morning tea, she noticed immediately that no light emanated from the Fairchild windows despite the lingering darkness and the bitter chill that had gripped the town for days. Mrs. Vance, a meticulous woman of 70 who had lived next to the Fairchilds for over 30 years, knew their household routine as well as her own. Arthur always rose before dawn to review his ledgers and prepare for the day's business. Eleanor would follow shortly after, starting breakfast for the family and preparing the children for their morning lessons. The absence of light from their house on such a cold, dark morning was unprecedented and alarming. Concerned for her neighbors' welfare, Mrs. Vance wrapped herself in a heavy woolen shawl and made her way across the misty, dew-covered lawn that separated the two houses. The fog lay undisturbed, except for a single set of tracks leading from the Fairchilds' front door toward the dense woods bordering the town's western edge. The tracks appeared to have been made by bare feet, an impossibility in the brutal autumn chill that should have meant hypothermia within minutes. The front door of the Fairchild house stood slightly ajar, unusual for a family that was meticulous about maintaining warmth during the chilly autumn. Mrs. Vance called out as she approached, expecting to hear Arthur's booming voice responding from within. Instead, she was met with a silence so complete it seemed to press against her ears like a physical weight. Pushing open the door, Mrs. Vance stepped into a scene that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The house was bitterly cold, colder even than the autumn air outside, as if the very warmth of human life had been drained from the rooms. In the kitchen, she found the family's breakfast table set with their finest china, as if they had been expecting important guests. 5 bowls contained congealed oatmeal grown cold and solid. 5 cups held tea that had filmed over into a cloudy amber. Most disturbing of all, the places were set for 6 people, not 5. An extra bowl, cup, and silverware had been carefully arranged at the head of the table in the position traditionally reserved for honored guests. Mrs. Vance had eaten with the Fairchild family many times over the years, and knew they never used their formal dining service for everyday meals. The presence of the 6th place setting suggested they had been expecting someone important enough to warrant their best dishes. In the parlor, she found the children's school books lying open on the writing desk, quill pens dropped mid-sentence, as if the young scholars had simply stopped writing in the middle of their assignments. Clara's half-finished watercolor painting sat on an easel, the brushes still resting in a jar of murky water. Thomas's butterfly collection lay splayed open, a specimen halfway pinned to a board. The twins' dolls were arranged precisely in a miniature tea party, a game interrupted, not abandoned. Most mysteriously, the family's autumn clothing hung neatly on pegs by the front door. Heavy woolen coats, fur-lined gloves, knitted scarves, and sturdy leather boots, all the protective garments essential for survival in the brutal October cold, remained in the house. If the Fairchilds had left voluntarily, they had walked out into temperatures that could kill an exposed human being within an hour, wearing nothing more than their indoor clothing. Mrs. Vance's screams brought neighbors running from all directions, their voices creating a cacophony of alarm that shattered the autumn morning silence. Constable John O'Connell arrived within minutes, having heard the commotion from his house 2 streets away. A methodical man who had served as Salem's primary law enforcement officer for 15 years, O'Connell immediately began a systematic examination of the scene. He found no signs of struggle anywhere in the house. Furniture remained in its proper places. Nothing had been overturned or displaced, and no valuable items appeared to be missing. Arthur's strongbox, hidden behind a loose brick in his study, contained $287 in gold coins and currency, a substantial sum that no thief would have overlooked. Eleanor's jewelry, including a diamond brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, lay undisturbed in her bedroom dresser. The family's prize-winning collie in the doghouse behind the property had been fed and watered that very morning. Fresh straw filled his bed, and his water bowl was full. Someone had performed these essential chores with the same care and attention that Arthur showed every day. Yet he and his family were nowhere to be found. Most puzzling of all was the set of tracks leading from the front door toward the forest. Constable O'Connell, who had grown up hunting in the woods around Salem, immediately recognized that these footprints had been made by bare human feet. 5 sets of tracks, 2 adult-sized, 3 smaller, led directly away from the house in a perfectly straight line, as if the family had walked with single-minded purpose toward some specific destination. But the tracks told an impossible story. The mist was thick, the ground slick with dew, and the temperature hadn't risen above 40 degrees Fahrenheit in 3 days. No human being could walk barefoot through such conditions for more than a few minutes without suffering severe frostbite or hypothermia that would make further walking impossible. Yet the tracks showed no signs of stumbling, no indication of distress or hurry, no evidence that the walkers had experienced any difficulty at all. The search party that formed that afternoon included every able-bodied man in Salem and several from neighboring towns. Led by Constable O'Connell and organized by Dr. Elias Thorne, the most educated man in the community, the searchers followed the tracks as far as they could be traced. The footprints led in a straight line for nearly half a mile, crossing fields and stone walls with mechanical precision, never deviating from their westward course. At the edge of the old-growth forest that separated Salem from the wild beyond, the tracks simply vanished. Not gradually, not obscured by wind or falling leaves, but ended abruptly as if the 5 people who had made them had simply ceased to exist. The searchers combed the forest for 4 days, calling the family's names until their voices grew hoarse, examining every fallen log, every depression in the damp earth, every possible shelter where 5 people might have sought refuge. They found nothing. No clothing, no bodies, no sign that human beings had ever passed that way. It was as if the Fairchild family had walked to the edge of the known world and stepped into nothingness, leaving behind only the mystery of their disappearance and the growing fear that something unnatural had visited their peaceful community. What disturbed the searchers most, however, was not what they found in the forest, but what they remembered from the days preceding the disappearance. Several men recalled seeing Nathaniel Hawthorne speaking with Arthur Fairchild outside Mason's general store just 2 days before the family vanished. The conversation had attracted attention because of its intensity. Hawthorne had spoken in low, urgent tones, while Fairchild listened with an expression of growing fascination that bordered on entrancement. Mr. Josiah Mason, the store's proprietor, had been close enough to overhear portions of the conversation. He later told Constable O'Connell that Hawthorne had been discussing what he called the burden of inherited narratives and the liberation that comes from shedding ancestral burdens. Mason had thought it an odd topic for casual conversation, but Hawthorne's scholarly reputation made such philosophical discussions seem normal, even admirable. More troubling still was the testimony of young Samuel Thorne, Dr. Thorne's 17-year-old son, and one of Hawthorne's informal research assistants. Samuel revealed that Nathaniel Hawthorne had recently assigned a new type of ethnographic study to his advanced pupils, detailed character analyses of their own family members, focusing on what he called moments of intergenerational conflict and private struggles with societal expectations. Clara Fairchild had been particularly enthusiastic about this assignment, Samuel recalled. She had spent hours in the Athenaeum's archives researching her family's history and interviewing elderly relatives about events from her parents' youth. Her final essay, which she had submitted to Nathaniel Hawthorne just 1 week before the disappearance, had reportedly contained information about her father's past business dealings that Clara claimed would explain why father sometimes seemed so distant during family gatherings. When Constable O'Connell requested to examine Clara's essay, Nathaniel Hawthorne explained that all student work was confidential and that releasing it without permission would violate the trust essential to his research methods. The explanation was reasonable, the refusal polite but firm, and O'Connell lacked any legal authority to demand access to academic materials. But the coincidence troubled many in the community. Nathaniel Hawthorne had somehow gained detailed knowledge of the Fairchild family's private life through his student's assignment, had engaged Arthur in an intense philosophical conversation about shame and hidden identity, and within days the entire family had vanished without explanation. The connection seemed obvious, yet proving any wrongdoing was impossible when no crime had been committed that anyone could identify. The disappearance of the Fairchild family was just the beginning of a horror that would transform Salem into a community paralyzed by fear and suspicion. If you're enjoying this investigation into one of New England's most disturbing mysteries, hit that like button and let us know in the comments if you've ever heard similar stories from your own region. Don't forget to subscribe. We have many more dark historical cases that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature. As October gave way to November, the mystery of the Fairchild family's fate became the sole topic of conversation in Salem's homes, shops, and churches. Some residents began locking their doors for the first time in their lives. Others started traveling in groups, afraid to venture out alone. And a few began to watch Nathaniel Hawthorne with new eyes, wondering what role the mysterious scholar might have played in the disappearance of one of their community's most respected families. As the weeks following the Fairchild disappearance stretched into a month, the mystery spawned theories that ranged from the rational to the bizarre throughout Salem's tight-knit community. The most practical residents suggested that Arthur's shipping business had attracted the attention of ruthless pirates who had somehow coerced the family into leaving their home to access hidden wealth or trade secrets. Others pointed to the unusual severity of the autumn, speculating that the family had succumbed to a form of sea madness brought on by the pervasive mist and isolation. The more religiously inclined citizens whispered of divine judgment, suggesting that some hidden sin had brought God's wrath upon the Fairchilds. This theory gained traction when Reverend Elijah Sterling mentioned in his Sunday sermon that the family had missed church services 3 times in recent months, an unprecedented absence that some interpreted as evidence of spiritual backsliding. The Catholic immigrants, led by Father Michael O'Malley, countered with theories about ancient curses connected to the land itself, drawing upon folklore from their native Ireland about places where the earth could consume the living. Most disturbing of all were the whispers about old Puritan curses and the vengeful spirits of those accused during the witch trials, superstitions that rational citizens normally dismissed, but found themselves considering in the face of such an inexplicable event. Old-timers recalled stories their grandparents had told about the original inhabitants of Salem, suggesting that the Fairchilds had somehow violated sacred ground and been claimed by forces that predated European settlement. Nathaniel Hawthorne seemed uniquely untroubled by the community's growing anxiety. While others organized additional search parties and held prayer meetings to ask for divine guidance in locating the missing family, he continued his regular routine with mechanical precision that some found reassuring and others thought callously indifferent. His evening walks never ceased, though several residents noted that his route had expanded to include streets he had never explored before, and his attention to the houses he passed had become even more intense. Students at the Athenaeum and his informal research assistants reported that their mentor's teaching methods had undergone subtle but significant changes since the Fairchild disappearance. He had introduced new writing exercises that required them to analyze the psychological motivations behind characters in historical narratives, focusing particularly on moments when individuals chose to abandon their previous lives in pursuit of perceived higher truths. His assignments increasingly demanded that students examine their own families with the detached perspective of social scientists, documenting private conversations, behavioral patterns, and evidence of hidden conflicts or unresolved guilt. These academic exercises might have seemed harmless if not for their unsettling specificity. Nathaniel Hawthorne asked his students to identify which family members seemed most burdened by private shame, which appeared to be hiding secrets from the rest of the household, and which showed signs of what he termed narrative fragility under pressure. He encouraged them to observe their parents and siblings as case studies in human vulnerability, rewarding the most insightful observations with praise that made the young men and women eager to delve even deeper into their families' private lives. Samuel Thorne, Dr. Elias Thorne's 17-year-old son, found himself particularly drawn to these assignments despite growing unease about their implications. Samuel was an intelligent, sensitive young man who had always been close to his family. But Nathaniel Hawthorne's exercises forced him to view his parents and younger sister, Mary, through a new lens that revealed flaws and vulnerabilities he had never noticed before. Under Hawthorne's guidance, Samuel began documenting his father's tendency towards solitary introspection during the long autumn evenings, noting how Dr. Thorne would sometimes sit for hours staring into the fireplace with an expression of profound regret. He recorded his mother, Sarah's, habit of meticulously arranging household items, behavior that suggested an underlying anxiety about control that went beyond normal orderliness. Most troubling of all, he found himself analyzing 14-year-old Mary's occasional outbursts of creative defiance, wondering what suppressed desires might be hidden in his sister's unconscious mind. Dr. Elias Thorne was one of the few men in Salem with sufficient education and intellectual sophistication to engage Nathaniel Hawthorne as an equal in philosophical conversation. A graduate of Harvard Medical School, Dr. Thorne had initially welcomed Hawthorne's arrival, hoping for stimulating discussions about literature, science, and moral philosophy that would provide intellectual companionship in a community where most conversations centered on shipping, commerce, and local gossip. Their first meetings had been everything Dr. Thorne had hoped for. Nathaniel Hawthorne proved to be extraordinarily well-read, fluent in multiple languages, and capable of discussing complex topics ranging from European political philosophy to the latest developments in early psychological theories. He showed particular interest in Dr. Thorne's knowledge of human anatomy and physiology, asking detailed questions about the relationship between physical health and mental state that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the emerging connections between mind and body. But as their conversations continued through the autumn and early winter months, Dr. Thorne began to notice troubling patterns in Hawthorne's thinking. The scholar seemed obsessed with human weakness and vulnerability, constantly steering discussions toward topics like psychological manipulation, the breaking point of human endurance, and the methods by which one person might gain complete control over another's will. He spoke of these matters not with the clinical detachment of a scholar, but with an enthusiasm that bordered on excitement. Most disturbing was Hawthorne's apparent knowledge of intimate details about families throughout Salem, knowledge that went far beyond what any newcomer should have been able to acquire through casual social interaction. During their conversations, he would make offhand references to private medical consultations Dr. Thorne had conducted, family disputes he had witnessed, and personal struggles of community members that should have been known only to their closest friends and relatives. When Dr. Thorne questioned how he had acquired such detailed information about the private lives of Salem's residents, Nathaniel Hawthorne would smile and speak vaguely of his narrative investigations and his talent for reading the subtle signs of human experience. He claimed that careful observation and analysis could reveal far more about people than they realized, suggesting that most individuals were transparent to anyone with sufficient knowledge of human nature and its underlying narratives. Dr. Thorne's growing unease intensified dramatically as he observed changes in his son Samuel's behavior throughout the autumn months. The boy, once open and communicative with his family, began exhibiting a secretive, calculating demeanor that seemed completely foreign to his previously warm and trusting personality. Samuel started studying his family members with cold, analytical attention, watching his parents and sister as if they were specimens under a microscope rather than the people he loved most in the world. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Samuel began asking probing questions about his parents' past, their relationship, their private concerns and fears. He showed unusual interest in family financial matters, wanting to know about debts, investments, and business relationships that had never concerned him before. Most alarming of all, he started making observations about his family's psychological state that demonstrated a sophistication far beyond his years and a clinical detachment that chilled his father's blood. During one particularly disturbing conversation in late October, Samuel had analyzed his mother's behavior with the cold precision of a trained alienist. He spoke of her underlying anxiety patterns, her compensatory mechanisms for managing unresolved guilt, and her vulnerability to psychological pressure during periods of social isolation. When Dr. Thorne demanded to know where a 17-year-old boy had learned such terminology and concepts, Samuel replied that Nathaniel Hawthorne was teaching his advanced students to become scientific observers of human narratives. The final alarm bell rang when Dr. Thorne discovered that his son had been keeping detailed written records of these family observations. Records that he submitted weekly to Nathaniel Hawthorne as part of his academic assignments. Samuel showed his father several pages from what he called his phenomenological journal, describing Dr. Thorne's own behavior with clinical detachment that revealed intimate knowledge of his private thoughts, fears, and professional concerns. The journal entries made clear that Samuel had been systematically documenting every aspect of his family's private life for months, recording conversations he had overheard, analyzing emotional responses to various situations, and identifying what he termed narrative pressure points that could be used to influence family members' behavior. Reading his own life dissected with such cold analytical precision, Dr. Thorne felt as though he were viewing his family through the eyes of a predator studying potential prey. Most chilling of all was Samuel's description of his little sister, Mary. The 14-year-old girl whom Dr. Thorne considered the gentlest and most innocent member of his family was analyzed in terms of her susceptibility to manipulation through appeals to her artistic sensitivities and her potential for psychological breakdown if subjected to sustained emotional pressure regarding her perceived failures to meet societal expectations. Dr. Thorne realized with growing horror that his son was no longer simply attending Nathaniel Hawthorne's informal seminars. He was being systematically trained as an instrument of psychological espionage against his own family. The boy's natural love and concern for his parents and sister had been perverted into a clinical detachment that allowed him to study their vulnerabilities with scientific precision, all in service of some larger purpose that Dr. Thorne was only beginning to comprehend. The scope of Nathaniel Hawthorne's influence became even clearer when Dr. Thorne began discreetly interviewing other parents whose sons and daughters attended the Athenaeum's informal study groups. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Every student in Hawthorne's advanced narrative studies was conducting similar ethnographic analyses of their families, documenting private behaviors and conversations in detailed journals that they submitted regularly to their mentor. The parents Dr. Thorne spoke with had all noticed similar changes in their children's behavior, a new secretiveness, an analytical approach to family relationships, and an unsettling tendency to ask probing questions about private matters. But most had attributed these changes to normal adolescent development or the natural result of advanced education. Only when Dr. Thorne pointed out the patterns did they begin to recognize the systematic nature of the transformation their children had undergone. Nathaniel Hawthorne had effectively turned the Athenaeum's most promising students into unwitting spies within their own households, gathering intelligence about Salem's most prominent families with a thoroughness that would have impressed a military intelligence operation. Every private conversation, every family dispute, every moment of vulnerability or weakness was being documented and reported to a man whose true purposes remained completely hidden behind a façade of scholarly respectability. As November progressed and the mystery of the Fairchild family's disappearance remained unsolved, Dr. Thorne began to suspect that their fate was somehow connected to the systematic psychological manipulation Nathaniel Hawthorne was conducting throughout the community. The scholar's detailed knowledge of private family matters, combined with his apparent ability to influence student behavior so profoundly, suggested capabilities that went far beyond normal educational methods. But understanding the scope of Hawthorne's activities and proving any connection to the Fairchild disappearance were entirely different challenges. No laws existed in 1879 to address psychological manipulation or the systematic gathering of private information. Even if Dr. Thorne could demonstrate that Nathaniel Hawthorne was conducting some form of social experiment using the families of Salem as unwitting subjects, no legal framework existed to address such activities. More troubling still was the realization that Hawthorne's influence extended beyond his own students. Dr. Thorne's investigation revealed that the scholar had cultivated relationships with numerous adults throughout the community: shopkeepers, domestic servants, tradespeople, and laborers who found themselves drawn into conversations that seemed casual, but were actually sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations. The picture that emerged was of a man who had spent 2.5 years systematically mapping the psychological landscape of an entire community, identifying vulnerabilities, documenting weaknesses, and perhaps conducting experiments in human manipulation that the science of his time had no framework to understand or address. If Nathaniel Hawthorne was indeed responsible for the Fairchild family's disappearance, he had achieved something far more disturbing than simple murder. He had somehow convinced 5 people to abandon their lives voluntarily, walking into certain death with apparent willingness. The question that haunted Dr. Thorne as November gave way to December was not whether Nathaniel Hawthorne possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to orchestrate such psychological manipulation, but whether anyone would believe such capabilities were possible in an era when the science of the human mind was still in its infancy. The very sophistication of Hawthorne's methods made them invisible to a community that lacked the conceptual tools to recognize psychological warfare when it was being conducted in their midst. The second family to vanish from Salem disappeared during the early morning hours of November 10th, exactly 38 days after the Fairchilds had walked into the wilderness. This time it was the Bradford household: Thomas Bradford, the town's master clockmaker, his wife Rebecca, and their 2 daughters, Abigail and Sarah, both 16 years old. Like their predecessors, they left behind no explanation, took no possessions, and departed their home wearing only nightclothes, despite the brutal cold that continued to grip coastal Massachusetts. Thomas Bradford was a man whose meticulous precision and steady temperament had made him indispensable to the community. Standing just over 5.5 feet tall and weighing a wiry 140 pounds, all of it honed by years of intricate work with delicate gears and springs, he was the kind of man who seemed incapable of being intimidated or coerced by any earthly force. His workshop on Washington Street was the heart of Salem's temporal life, producing everything from grand-grandfather clocks to tiny, intricate pocket watches. What made Thomas's disappearance particularly shocking was his reputation for unshakable intellectual rigor. He had served as a trusted advisor to the Athenaeum for 10 years, leading discussions on scientific advancements and organizing exhibitions of new technologies. His calm, logical mind had guided countless debates, and his steadfast presence had provided a sense of stability to community discussions. Rebecca Bradford was equally respected, known throughout the town for her skill as a weaver and textile artist. She had produced intricate tapestries and finely detailed linens for many of Salem's wealthiest families, and her knowledge of dyes and fibers was unmatched. The twin daughters, Abigail and Sarah, were accomplished musicians who supplemented the family income by giving piano and violin lessons to the children of prominent families. The Bradford family's disappearance followed an identical pattern to the Fairchilds. Neighbors found their house cold and empty, breakfast half prepared on the table, and bare footprints leading directly toward the forest. But this time there was a crucial witness to the events preceding the vanishing. Reverend Elijah Sterling had observed Rebecca Bradford in intense conversation with Nathaniel Hawthorne outside the Athenaeum just 2 days before her family disappeared. The discussion had lasted nearly an hour, with Hawthorne speaking in his characteristic low, compelling tones while Rebecca listened with growing fascination. Reverend Sterling later described her expression as transformed, no longer the practical, grounded woman he had known for years, but someone experiencing what appeared to be a profound philosophical revelation. Dr. Thorne's investigation revealed that Thomas Bradford had also been receiving visits from Nathaniel Hawthorne at his workshop. Under the pretense of commissioning a unique timepiece for his study, Hawthorne had engaged the clockmaker in philosophical discussions about the nature of time, the illusion of free will, and the burden of societal expectations. These conversations had reportedly left Thomas deeply troubled, causing him to spend long evening hours working on a complex, unsettling mechanism that seemed to serve no practical purpose. The pattern was becoming clear, and it terrified Dr. Thorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne was systematically targeting families, using intelligence gathered through his network of student informants to identify specific psychological vulnerabilities, then exploiting those weaknesses through carefully orchestrated conversations that somehow convinced entire households to abandon their lives voluntarily. By early December, Dr. Thorne had uncovered the full scope of Nathaniel Hawthorne's intelligence network through painstaking investigation that revealed a web of surveillance more sophisticated than anything he could have imagined. The scholar had cultivated informants throughout every level of Salem society, from domestic servants who overheard private family conversations to shopkeepers who observed customers' behavior and purchasing patterns. Each informant believed they were the only one. Each felt specially chosen for their keen insights into human nature. Mrs. Agnes Crumley, the elderly seamstress who worked for multiple households, provided the most damning testimony during her recovery from a severe bout of influenza that had loosened her tongue. She revealed that Nathaniel Hawthorne had approached her in the summer, shortly after his arrival, offering payment for what he called observations on the human tapestry within the families she served. What had begun as innocent details, who visited whom, what garments were ordered, what repairs were requested, had gradually evolved into systematic espionage, targeting the most intimate aspects of private life. "He has a way of making you want to tell him everything," Mrs. Crumley confessed to Dr. Thorne, her hands trembling as she recalled their monthly meetings. "He would sit in that elegant parlor of his, offering tea and speaking to me as if I were a learned woman whose opinions mattered. He asked such thoughtful questions about human behavior, made me feel as though my observations were tremendously important scientific data. Before you realize what's happening, you've shared secrets that could destroy the very people who trust." You with their most private moments. The web extended far beyond domestic servants. Dr. Thorne discovered young Peter Jenkins, the 15-year-old delivery boy who delivered groceries throughout the town, had been reporting on arguments between husbands and wives that he overheard while making his rounds. Eliza Green, the laundress who worked in private homes, documented family financial struggles revealed through the types of fabrics used or the condition of worn clothing. Even Postmaster Samuel Davies, sworn to confidentiality about correspondence, admitted to sharing information about letter patterns, who received communications from distant relatives, who conducted business with creditors in other towns, who maintained contact with associates that might suggest hidden aspects of their past. Most disturbing was the systematic nature of Hawthorne's intelligence gathering. Dr. Thorne found evidence that the scholar maintained detailed files on every prominent family in Salem, cross-referencing information from multiple sources to build comprehensive psychological profiles. These files contain not just facts, but analysis, identifying each family's vulnerabilities, mapping their relationships, and predicting how they might respond to various forms of psychological pressure. Nathaniel Hawthorne had constructed this network with masterful psychological manipulation that exploited each informant's deepest needs and insecurities. He convinced Mrs. Crumley that her observations were contributing to important research that would help future generations understand the human narrative better. He made Peter Jenkins feel intellectually valuable by praising his insights into adult behavior, treating a barely literate delivery boy as if he were a trained sociologist. He appealed to Eliza Green's sense of justice by suggesting that wealthy families' private struggles deserved documentation to balance their public pretenses of perfection. Each informant received payment carefully calibrated to create dependence without arousing suspicion. Enough money to improve their circumstances noticeably, but not so much as to suggest anything unusual was occurring. More importantly, Hawthorne fed their need for recognition and importance, making each person feel that their particular position in the community provided unique access to valuable information that no one else could obtain. The third family disappearance occurred on December 1st, following the now familiar pattern, but with additional details that revealed the sophistication of Hawthorne's methods. The Garrison family, a prominent legal family headed by Edward Garrison, his wife Margaret, and their two children, Robert, aged 18, and Susan, 14, vanished after Edward had spent 3 weeks in increasingly agitated conversations with Nathaniel Hawthorne about what the scholar called the hidden burdens of legal precedent. Dr. Thorne's investigation revealed that Hawthorne had somehow learned about Edward's grandfather's role in a controversial land dispute from the 1700s, a family secret that had been carefully buried for over a century. Through careful manipulation of conversations and chance encounters with individuals who mentioned historical legal cases, Hawthorne had gradually made Edward believe that his family's past misdeeds were becoming known throughout the community. The psychological campaign against the Garrison family demonstrated Hawthorne's most sophisticated techniques. He didn't simply threaten exposure of the family's secret. He orchestrated a series of seemingly unrelated events that made Edward feel as though the truth was gradually surfacing on its own. A casual comment about old land deeds overheard at the county archives, a stranger asking directions to the site of the disputed property, a book about historical legal ethics prominently displayed in Nathaniel Hawthorne's study during Robert's research sessions. All carefully planned to erode Edward's sense of security. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of Hawthorne's manipulation, the horror in Salem intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what Dr. Thorne found when he realized his own family was being targeted. The most chilling discovery came when Dr. Thorne realized that his own son, Samuel, had been recruited not just as an informant, but as an active participant in psychological manipulation campaigns against other families. Samuel revealed that Nathaniel Hawthorne had begun training select students in what he called narrative influence techniques, teaching them to recognize psychological vulnerabilities in others and to exploit those weaknesses for what he termed anthropological research purposes. Samuel described assignments that went far beyond simple observation. He and other advanced students were instructed to engage specific community members in conversations designed to probe for psychological weak points, to introduce ideas that would create anxiety or self-doubt, and to report back on how their targets responded to various forms of social pressure. They were being trained as junior manipulators, learning to weaponize human psychology under the guise of academic study. The confrontation that would expose Nathaniel Hawthorne's true methods came when Dr. Thorne discovered his son preparing to submit a report that contained details about a family secret so devastating it could destroy the Thornes' standing in the community forever. The report documented Dr. Thorne's private struggle with gambling addiction, developed during his early medical practice when he had sought to escape the pressures of his demanding profession, and carefully hidden from his family and patients for over 2 decades. Samuel had somehow deduced his father's dependency through systematic observation techniques Nathaniel Hawthorne had taught him. The evidence was subtle but damning. The slight tremor in Dr. Thorne's hands during certain evening hours when he was restless, his defensive reactions when patients mentioned financial losses, his habit of taking extended trips to Boston that corresponded with periods of unusual anxiety and irritability when he was absent from local card games. "How could you know this?" Dr. Thorne demanded, confronting his son in the privacy of his study at midnight. "How could you possibly have determined something I've hidden from everyone, including your mother?" Samuel's response chilled his father to the bone. Nathaniel Hawthorne taught us that every human weakness leaves signs for those trained to recognize them. He showed us how to map behavioral patterns, how to identify the physical symptoms of various forms of guilt and shame, how to construct psychological profiles based on careful observation. "Father, I can read you like an open book because he taught me exactly what to look for." The boy's clinical detachment was more disturbing than any anger or accusation would have been. Samuel spoke of his father's addiction with the same dispassionate analysis he might apply to a chemical experiment, cataloging symptoms and behaviors without any apparent awareness that he was destroying the trust and love that had defined their relationship for 17 years. Further questioning revealed the full scope of Nathaniel Hawthorne's training program. Select students were taught to become human microscopes, capable of detecting the slightest signs of psychological vulnerability in anyone they encountered. More than that, they were instructed in methods for exploiting these weaknesses, how to phrase questions that would provoke revealing responses, how to introduce concepts that would create self-doubt, how to manipulate social situations to increase their target's sense of isolation and shame. Samuel revealed that Nathaniel Hawthorne possessed what he called his Atlas of the Human Soul, a comprehensive manual documenting the precise methods required to break down any individual's mental defenses. The atlas contained detailed case studies from Hawthorne's work in other communities, step-by-step instructions for identifying and exploiting psychological pressure points, and theoretical frameworks for understanding human manipulation that were decades ahead of any published scientific knowledge. He showed us portions of it during our advanced seminars, Samuel explained with the enthusiasm of a dedicated student. The atlas documents how every person can be reduced to their essential vulnerabilities if you understand the proper techniques. Further, he's proven that human conviction is infinitely malleable, that anyone can be convinced to abandon their previous existence if the appropriate psychological pressure is applied with sufficient skill and patience. The most horrifying revelation was that Nathaniel Hawthorne didn't simply study human weakness. He actively created it through his network of informants and student operatives. He orchestrated elaborate situations that forced people into moral compromises, then used evidence of these compromises to increase their psychological vulnerability. He arranged for gambling debts to be called in at moments of maximum financial stress, ensured that old romantic indiscretions were accidentally revealed to spouses, and created social situations where people were pressured into making decisions they would later regret. The Fairchilds, the Bradfords, the Garrisons, none of them were random victims, Samuel continued, his voice carrying an excitement that made Dr. Thorne's stomach turn. They were carefully selected test subjects for techniques Nathaniel Hawthorne had been developing for years. Each family represented a different type of psychological profile, a different combination of vulnerabilities that allowed him to test and refine his methods of manipulation. Dr. Thorne demanded to see the reports Samuel had been submitting, and what he read convinced him that his son had been systematically documenting every aspect of their family's private life for months. The reports contained intimate details about Dr. Thorne's medical practice, his relationship with his wife, Sarah, his concerns about their financial security, and his private fears about his professional reputation. Samuel had recorded conversations he had overheard, analyzed emotional responses to various family situations, and identified what he termed narrative pressure points that could be used to influence each family member's behavior. Most chilling of all was Samuel's analysis of his 14-year-old sister, Mary. The report described her susceptibility to manipulation through appeals to her artistic sensitivities and her potential for psychological breakdown if subjected to sustained emotional pressure regarding her perceived failures to meet parental expectations. Reading his innocent daughter analyzed as a potential victim for psychological manipulation, Dr. Thorne felt a rage so intense it threatened to overwhelm his rational mind. "You've been studying your own family like laboratory specimens," Dr. Thorne said, his voice barely controlled. "You've been documenting our private lives, our weaknesses, our most intimate moments, and reporting everything to that monster. Don't you understand what you've done? Don't you realize you've been helping him plan our destruction?" Samuel's response revealed the full extent of his psychological conditioning. "I've been contributing to important scientific research that will advance human understanding of psychological behavior. Nathaniel Hawthorne says that sentiment and family loyalty are obstacles to objective analysis. He's teaching us to see human nature clearly, without the distortions created by emotional attachment." The boy's transformation was complete. Nathaniel Hawthorne had systematically stripped away Samuel's natural love and loyalty to his family, replacing these bonds with cold, analytical detachment that allowed him to view his parents and sister as research subjects rather than the people he had once loved most in the world. Armed with this devastating knowledge, Dr. Thorne made the dangerous decision to confront Nathaniel Hawthorne directly. On the night of December 10th, he arrived at the scholar's house carrying copies of the intelligence reports his son had been submitting, evidence of the systematic psychological manipulation being conducted throughout the community, and a loaded derringer hidden beneath his coat. He was prepared to do whatever proved necessary to stop the destruction of his community and his family. Nathaniel Hawthorne received him in his elegantly appointed study, surrounded by leather-bound books and scientific instruments that suggested scholarly respectability. But Dr. Thorne now recognized these trappings for what they were, a carefully constructed façade designed to conceal the activities of a man who had turned human suffering into a science. "Dr. Thorne," Hawthorne said with his characteristic calm smile, "I've been expecting this visit. Your son mentioned that you had discovered his academic reports. I assume you have questions about the anthropological research we've been conducting." The conversation that followed revealed Nathaniel Hawthorne as something unprecedented in Dr. Thorne's experience, a man who combined brilliant intelligence with a complete absence of human empathy. Hawthorne showed no remorse for the families he had destroyed, no concern for the suffering he had caused, no recognition that his actions constituted anything other than legitimate scientific inquiry. "You speak of these people as if they were wrong, Doctor," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes reflecting the gaslight with an intensity that made Dr. Thorne's skin crawl. "But I have given them the greatest gift possible, freedom from the prison of social pretense and unexamined narratives. The Fairchilds, the Bradfords, the Garrisons, each chose to walk away from lives built on lies and moral compromises. I merely helped them recognize that their masks had become unbearable burdens." When Dr. Thorne accused him of murder, Nathaniel Hawthorne laughed with genuine amusement. "Murder requires a corpse, Doctor. I have created something far more elegant. The complete dissolution of identity without violence, without coercion, without breaking any laws that your primitive legal system would recognize. I have proven that human conviction is infinitely malleable, that any person can be convinced to abandon their previous existence if the proper psychological pressure is applied with sufficient skill." Nathaniel Hawthorne revealed that his work in Salem was part of a larger research project being conducted by a network of like-minded individuals throughout New England and beyond. They were systematically testing and refining techniques for psychological manipulation, sharing their findings through encrypted correspondence, and building a comprehensive understanding of human mental vulnerability that was decades ahead of any official scientific knowledge. "We are pioneers, Doctor, exploring territories of the human mind that official science lacks the courage to investigate. The universities concern themselves with dead languages and abstract philosophy, while we conduct real research into the fundamental nature of human consciousness. My colleagues in Maine, Vermont, Connecticut, and New York have achieved similar results using the methods we have developed together." Hawthorne showed Dr. Thorne portions of his correspondence with these collaborators, letters that described refined techniques for psychological conditioning, improved methods for identifying vulnerable targets, and ongoing experiments in human manipulation being conducted in dozens of communities throughout New England. The scholar had not been an isolated madman, but rather a founding member of an underground network dedicated to advancing the science of psychological warfare. "The human mind is far more malleable than people realize," Hawthorne explained with scientific enthusiasm. "Most individuals live their entire lives without understanding their own psychological mechanisms. They believe their thoughts and decisions are their own, never recognizing how easily these can be influenced by someone who understands the proper techniques. I have simply documented and systematized what charlatans and confidence men have known instinctively for centuries." Dr. Thorne realized that any attempt to expose Nathaniel Hawthorne through legal channels would fail completely. No laws existed in 1879 to address psychological manipulation. No courts would understand accusations involving systematic mental conditioning, and no authorities possessed the conceptual framework necessary to comprehend crimes that left no physical evidence. Hawthorne had operated in a realm beyond the reach of contemporary justice, using methods so advanced they were essentially invisible to his era's primitive understanding of human psychology. Instead, Dr. Thorne chose a more direct approach. He revealed the loaded derringer and gave Nathaniel Hawthorne an ultimatum: leave Salem within 24 hours and never return, or face the consequences of a father protecting his family from a predator who threatened everything he held dear. Nathaniel Hawthorne agreed to depart, but not out of fear, out of satisfaction with his completed research. "You've actually done me a service, Doctor. I have gathered enough data from Salem to document my methods thoroughly, and this community has served its purpose as a testing ground for my theories. My colleagues and I have proven that psychological manipulation can be conducted with scientific precision, and we're ready to expand our research to larger population centers where the potential for impact is far greater." Nathaniel Hawthorne departed Salem on December 12, 1879, taking with him only his journals, his correspondence, and his atlas of the human soul. He left behind no forwarding address, no indication of his future plans, and no explanation for his 2.5 years of systematic psychological destruction. The Salem Athenaeum closed its advanced study program within a month of his departure, unable to attract students after parents learned of their children's unwitting participation in his experiments. The 5 families that vanished during that terrible autumn were never found. Search parties continued venturing into the wilderness for years, hoping to discover some trace of their loved ones, but the forest kept its secrets. Dr. Thorne maintained his belief that they had perished in the harsh conditions, their bodies claimed by scavengers and the elements, though he never stopped wondering if some had somehow survived to establish new identities in distant territories where their manufactured shame couldn't follow them. Dr. Elias Thorne spent the remainder of his life researching the psychological methods Hawthorne had employed, hoping to understand how one man could possess such devastating insight into human weakness. His private papers, eventually donated to Harvard Medical School after his death in 1905, provided some of the earliest American documentation of systematic psychological manipulation techniques, work that wouldn't be formally recognized as a field of study until the development of modern psychology in the early 20th century. This mystery shows us how easily human nature can be exploited by those who understand its deepest vulnerabilities. What do you think of Nathaniel Hawthorne's story? Could such sophisticated psychological techniques have existed in 1879, decades before psychology was recognized as a science? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts about this terrifying glimpse into the darker possibilities of human knowledge. If you enjoyed this dark historical mystery, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that explore the hidden corners of American history. See you in the next video, where we'll investigate another case that challenged everything people thought they knew about the limits of human manipulation. The families of Salem never learned that their loved ones had been victims of something science couldn't yet explain. A form of psychological warfare so advanced that it wouldn't be formally studied for another century. Nathaniel Hawthorne had proven that the human mind could be broken not through violence or coercion, but through the surgical application of shame, isolation, and false hope. In 1879, there was no name for what he had become, no framework for understanding his methods, and no way to stop someone who could convince people to destroy themselves with nothing more than carefully chosen words spoken at precisely the right moments to minds conditioned for maximum vulnerability.